Well, thanks to you for coming back and hearing talk number 2. This is focused more on my research, and it's a topic that, believe it or not, causes endless debate in the scientific community. What is the role of people in prehistoric times in shaping our landscape? And so I'm going to weigh in and tell you what some of the debates are and how they look at different spatial scales, and then the kind of work that we're doing, especially in this Wildfire PIRE Partnership in International Research and Education grant. And I'll acknowledge some of the people that I've worked with at the end. All right. This is going to be like my movie yesterday. Here we go. Okay. So as I was saying yesterday, in the last 20 years, we've had more large fires, not only in the western U.S. but around the world, than seems to have happened in historic times, at least than anyone can remember. And because we're seeing these fires, there's a large debate going on in the community, the scientific community, but also in the public domain as to what is the cause of those. Is it a result of sort of management practices, for example, years and decades of effective fire suppression, or are we really moving into a new climate condition and we're seeing the harbinger of climate change going on? And, there's no right answer. It's really a topic of debate in the literature. And when you think about where people weigh in on fire, you really, it's another one of these, you have to think about the temporal and spatial scale that you're talking about. So if you think about this triangle where you've got space here from microsites to continents and seconds to millennia here, well, you can talk about a single ignition, and the climate and fuel and conditions that cause a fire to start at one scale. That's a really small, short scale. Or you can talk about a fire event, something that happens in a year where fuels and weather and topography are really important. Or you can move up to longer and larger scales and talk about fire regimes. These are sort of the average fire conditions where you're looking at the average fire frequency, the average fire severity, the average fire size. And there you're thinking not about fuel, but about vegetation. You're thinking about what are the large regional controls. And you're not thinking about weather, but you're thinking about climate. Oops. And then going to the largest scale, I propose something called a meta-fire regime. Nobody's really taken me up on this, but I think you can look at long-term fire activity from the perspective of a biome, and you can look at long-term climate change and regional and continental scales. Now, people interact in all of those triangles, right? They start fires. They control the way fire moves across a landscape by the way they fragment the landscape or affect the fuels. They alter fire regimes. And then the question is, do they have this bigger scale, bigger effect at the meta fire regime level? So I want to talk a little bit about fire in the Earth system, why we even should care about fire. I want to, first of all, persuade you that fire is very strongly linked to climate, and there's no getting around that. You can't look at fire without talking about climate at some level. But then we're going to look at the influence of people, and we're going to look at the way the argument plays out when you look at people at a global scale, and then when you look at people at a regional scale. And I'll give you some examples where we've been working. And then at the end, we'll talk about what our vulnerability to fire is in the future. So fire's been around a long time. Fires are not something that people created. We find that as soon as the Earth's atmosphere had somewhere between 13% and 35% oxygen, you're capable of having combustion. And when that happened in the Earth's history, you started to get fires. And the whole evolution of land plants is really tightly coupled to fire. So fire is not a new thing. So we have the first, this is a paper by Andrew Scott and Glasspool. When you get the first record of vascular plants, you start to get the first evidence of fire in the geologic record. And then as oxygen levels go up and down, you find more fires and less fires. And as you move into the Mississippian, you start to get upland fires. When you get these really high oxygen levels, even the bogs are burning. And then you come into the Permian, you get high fire activity. So fire is not new. Even in Yellowstone, when you look at those petrified trees, those sequoias that are 35 to 55 million years old, they still have fire scars on them. So fire has been part of even the Yellowstone ecosystem forever. And plants have evolved a lot of adaptations that make them survive fires or even succeed with fires. Not all these adaptations arose as a result of fire, but nonetheless they benefit the plant in the face of fire. So you see a lot of disturbance traits evolving through time. Things like plants develop the ability to sprout. That's an adaptation to disturbance. They develop serotiny. Serotiny is when the cones get heated and the seeds get released. You see that in many species. You see smoke-induced germination. So there's some plants that will only germinate their seeds in the face of smoke. You have seeds that are dormant for a very long time. And then you see plants like, this is Banksia in Australia, that flower after fire. They flower after fire. So like in Australia, for example, you even get the stems starting to sprout after fire. This is a Banksia cone with these wooden follicles that are an adaptation to fire. And then this is early seeding coming in after disturbance. So plants evolve the ability to deal with disturbance and to deal with fire at various levels. And that's a long evolutionary trait. That's not something that just has shown up recently. Another interesting fact is William Bond, a few years ago, did some modeling with dynamic vegetation modeling to see, well, what would the world look like without fire versus with fire? And so here's the world's biomes with fire. So you can see there's a big gymnosperm forest, boreal forest here. You've got angiosperms here. You get large areas of C4 tropical grasses. In these models, when you take fire out, you really have a very different world. Now, it's not saying that all those fires are started by people or by climate, but fire is really an important part of the Earth's system, and I think this paper revealed it really nicely. Because when you take fire out, you change the sort of, you get more disconnectivity in boreal forests that are fire adapted. You get this vast area of rainforest, tropical and subtropical forest, in areas that today are grassland. And you see a reduction in C4 grasses at the expense of C3 grasses. So we definitely are a pyro world. Now, thinking about how you reconstruct past fires, there's a whole suite of tools that are available and have been used by various people to look at fire activity on different time scales. So, for example, most of us, when we think about historical fire records, we'll look at documentary or remote sensing types of records. Well, those cover only a few decades. They're very precise, but they can be global in extent, so they don't go back terribly far. If you want a longer record of fire, then you would go to the tree ring record, and you could look at fire scars on trees, or you could look at stand ages. And those would take you back into the realm of, you could cover, there's global records, not very good in the tropics, certainly not very good where there aren't trees, but they can go back years to decades to centuries. Longer time scales, there's some work done in soils on fire, work done in small hollows. These are the little wetlands in the forest. But mostly we turn to things like lake sediment records, and even ice core records have records of fire by looking at the chemistry and the presence of sugars that are created by fire. And those aren't as spatially as precise, but they can cover long periods of time. And so in the process of reconstructing fire regimes, you're moving from fire weather, the sorts of conditions that create an individual fire event, to fire climate, the sorts of conditions that embed a fire regime, right, as you go over longer time scales. Modeling, ecological modeling also covers a range of scales. So at the sort of more local stand level, you have these landscape models that look at fire behavior and the way fires move through different kinds of fuels. And then as you get to larger scales, you move into these Earth system dynamic vegetation models. So mostly what I do is in the lake sediment realm. of this. And reconstructing fire regimes, for me, involves bringing together the whole sort of toolkit that I use, particularly looking at charcoal in lake sediments. But you can't reconstruct a fire regime without knowing something about the fuels, so you have to do pollen analysis. You can't understand the fire effects without looking at things like the geochemistry and the magnetic susceptibility. And you can't understand fire climate without dragging in some other climate proxy like things like delta O18. So we go to lakes, as I was explaining yesterday, we get these sediment cores and we analyze them. And we've made a lot of improvements in fire history reconstructions, and it's partly been motivated by the Yellowstone fires in 1988. Nobody was really looking at fire history in lake sediment records until 1988, when it seemed like a great opportunity to really try to understand how charcoal gets into lake sediments, how far it travels, what size particle is going to be useful to look at. So Yellowstone was the beginning for my career in fire history, but also I think we've developed techniques that are being used around the world now. And the techniques that we use we call macroscopic because we're looking at pretty big particles. We're looking at particles that are 60 microns and bigger, which are big from a palynology point of view, and they don't travel so far. So we're not interested in being in Yellowstone, getting a sediment core, and ending up reconstructing a fire in Washington State. We want a local Yellowstone fire. So we look at large particles, and we also look at every single sample in the core. So we're not like taking every 10 centimeters a sample. We're looking at every centimeter or half centimeter of mud. So we're looking at thousands of samples. The community now, the fire history community, we all agree on the kind of site you should look at. We look at small lakes. We don't want lakes with inflowing streams. We want really simple systems because we want to only look at airborne charcoal coming into the lake. We all agree on how we collect sediment. We all agree on this idea of looking at continuous intervals of sediment. We generally sieve the samples to look for charcoal particles. Some people do image analysis on it. Sometimes we identify the particles of charcoal. We can certainly separate out wood charcoal from grass charcoal. That's really important in reconstructing the fire regime. Quantifying the charcoal, how we calculate the time intervals, and so on. So there's a lot of there really is a fire history community now that is fairly standardized in the way they do this macroscopic charcoal analysis. Not everybody does that much work to do fire history, so macroscopic analysis isn't done by everybody, but everybody that does it in a fairly similar way. So the idea is you have a small lake like this, so it's collecting pollen from the sort of watershed around it. That gets into the lake. The charcoal and macrofossil, well, the needles are coming into the lake. These are just the seeds and needles and other plant remains, but there's also charcoal coming in. And the idea is to try to really understand the spatial scale of all those sources of information so that you can then go back and reconstruct what the fire's regime is and make sure that everything's kind of looking at the same scale. And there's been just some really creative scientists now who have really tried to more explicitly model how charcoal gets into lakes and what the influence of different processes would be to sort of test some of the assumptions that we make. So the idea is most of the charcoal is airborne. Some of it lands on the surface and washes in. Some of it lands directly on the lake. Some of it lands on the shore and then works its way into the sediment. And all of that can be sort of modeled in trying to then backcast out what the source area is that produces that charcoal signal. So one place that Phil Higuera and I have worked, as I said yesterday, was in Yellowstone. And the reason we chose Yellowstone is it's this huge area where the tree ring record was studied by Bill Rami and Don Despain. This is all stand age data. So these are the ages, the grays are the ages of different lodgepole pine forests. So it's pretty much uniform fuel, but the trees are of different age, and the age of the trees tells you the date of the fire, because fires kill trees and the trees come back. So the lighter colors are the more recent fires, and the darker colors on this map are the older fires. And this is pre-1988, so 1988 is not shown on this. And then we went to various small lakes in the watershed, and we asked ourselves, well, how far does the charcoal come from these known fire events, and how can we better calibrate the charcoal record in the lake? And so here's the lakes that we had. We developed what would be appropriate threshold, how statistically significant a peak has to be to identify it as a fire event, how does it match the tree ring record of fires, and so on. And what we found was that the peaks, what we call the fire events, are actually very, very local in a charcoal record. So when we get a record and we're looking at the peaks, those are generally coming from fires within about a 3-kilometer radius of the fire. But the general trends in the data, what we call the background or the overall charcoal levels, matches very well with area burned within about a 20 or 30-kilometer radius of the lake. So the charcoal signal has two pieces of information: a general trend that's area burned, and then these peaks, which represent fire events that are pretty local. Another thing that we've done is we've looked at fire climate in a more synoptic way. So we've taken reanalysis data, and we've composited different years. For example, these are a composite of the climate conditions during high fire years in Montana. So this is years when there was a large area burned of fires, and tried to understand what are the sort of general circulation features that are associated with large fires in Montana. So this is, I think, about 8 fire years. And what we find is that when Montana has large area burned, in particular Yellowstone, it's associated with a very well-developed upper-level ridge off the Northeast Pacific. It's also that because of that ridge, it's associated with sinking air, shown here, and a very high, persistent high-pressure system in summertime. And then this is where I ask you to squint with me, but I think that if you look at model simulations for the early Holocene, there's some similarity in that kind of weather and these large fire years today. So for example, the early Holocene, remember when you get that summer insolation maximum I was talking about, is characterized by a very well-developed upper-level ridge shown in this simulation by orange. Sinking air wrapping around into the Rockies is shown by green here, matching that, and then a persistent high-pressure system similar to that. So what we're saying is that the kinds of conditions that give rise to large area burned now help explain why you get more fires over a long period of time in the early Holocene. The other thing that's been really gratifying is there's now a global charcoal community. There's something like, 600 records now in a global charcoal database that's available, that we can look at fire at different scales around the world. So when you look at this map, you can see, well, North America is really well done. This is a lot of work by my students, but also other people now. South America is well done. Australia, New Zealand, Southeast Asia, Europe is really well done. There's large areas where we don't have much paleo charcoal database from Siberia. Africa is still a big gap. But it's still quite impressive. These data are not all macroscopic charcoal records. It's a mishmash of everything. So the Russian records tend to be charcoal that are in fluvial stream cuts. South American stuff, some of it's soil charcoal. There's quite a lot of different kinds of database. And so if you actually interrogate the database, these are the kinds of data. This is the range of charcoal quantity. They've quantified in a whole bunch of different ways. Some of them are concentration, some of them are percentages, some of them are influx. They cover a huge span of time, and so part of the effort of the global charcoal community has been to try to put these data together in a way that they could be compared. And so that's been done by doing some rescaling and transforming of this is, for example, a single record. Here's the raw data. It's been transformed, and then it's converted into z-scores. And those z-scores are then done as an anomaly based on the last 1,000 years. So generally the anomaly, the base period for the anomaly is not the European period. And so you can see in this record, this early part of the record to prior to about 12,000, there's less charcoal than the base period. And then in the early Holocene, there's more charcoal, and then you can see it decreasing to the present day. So you've got low fire activity, high fire activity, and then a decline. This sort of trend is describing this sort of general pattern of the data. So you can kind of think of it as more of an area burned measurement than a peak measurement. It's not a fire event frequency. It's more telling you about sort of general trends in area burned. And the data sets, I don't know if you've seen papers that have come out using this global charcoal data, but we've done some really cool things with it. So for example, I don't know if you know about this debate around the Younger Dryas cooling period. This is a period from 12,900 to 11,500 years ago, where we know that the northern hemisphere especially got cooler than today. And there's been a proposal that that cooling was actually related to a comet impact. A comet broke up over the Laurentide ice sheet, and that caused cooling and mammal extinction and changing in the Clovis culture and so on. It's several papers led by Jim Kennett published in PNAS. Well, one of the things they proposed was that there were large fires in North America. Well, that's easy for us to do, easy for us to interrogate. So we went to the charcoal database. Here's the Greenland record of the Younger Dryas cooling. We looked at the charcoal to see if there in fact were more fires during that period. And I think we pretty much came to the conclusion that there weren't. You could see the fire activity is rising going into the Younger Dryas. There's a step-like period, but it's not an event. It's not a single event of fire. Fires stay pretty high, and then they rise as you go into the Holocene. So we came out with a paper that pretty much argued against the evidence that they had for a comet impact that related to fire. And I'll show you a couple other examples of that. Okay, so fire and climate linkages, as I said, I think are really strong. So let's start with just looking at recent fires in the western US. So this is a data set that goes from 1986 to 1996. So it's all the fires recorded by the Forest Service. And what my colleague Pat Bartlein is showing here are fires that the Forest Service identified as lightning-started versus human-started. And you can see it's scrolling through months. So it's basically 10 years of data for each of these months. And one thing you can see is the fires start here in the southwest, and they sort of track up here. And then the last fires kind of come, I think, in the California area. And if you look at the human-started fires, they follow that same pattern, but they kind of go farther into the season. So you can see some fires. If you look over here, you'll see fires going on into October, November. I think these are like hunter fires. I don't know. People starting fires way after the natural fire season. And so visually, I think the pattern is very similar between lightning and human-started fires, which gives you I think it can lead you to the conclusion that human-started fires aren't really doing something significantly different to the system than lightning-started fires. So another way of looking at these data are to just plot them by season. So here's the lightning-started fires. The fire season in the west starts in May, peaks in July, and then really drops off by the end of September. Here's the human-set fires. So you can see these broader shoulders. And you see this one amazing anomaly, which I guess is true. I mean, I guess we all go to the forest and just get drunk as can be and set it on fire on the 4th of July. I don't know what's going on there. We're all out there doing that. And then I think actually there's a little dip the day after, maybe where we're like, oh, that wasn't such a good idea. But it's basically the same pattern, except in changing the season, stretching the season. And then I showed you this data yesterday because I also think it's a really good example of fire-climate linkages. using that data set that was calibrated with the tree ring record. And it shows, again, that you got this big fire in 1988, but the other periods of fire definitely correspond with these red lines when you have the 10 driest years of the last 800 years. So there's fires associated with those 2 driest years, fires with those 2 driest years, fires there. And these big fires really they're not associated with wet years, they're very much associated with dry years. And I think that is a nice confirmation, too, that fires are very closely linked to climate. And then I showed you Cygnet Lake. This is in the lodgepole pine forest, so we just start out with tundra, sagebrush, and then it goes to lodgepole pine and doesn't really change very much. But again, here's the general trend. This is the area burned, that broad line, being low during tundra period, but then rising when you get into forest. And then these are the individual peaks, which are probably very local to Cygnet Lake. And you can see that there's this very high increase in fire frequency in the early Holocene when we know from the synoptic climate analysis that it was warmer and drier. And then as the climate becomes cooler and wetter in the late Holocene, fire frequency declines, even when the vegetation doesn't. So it's not a fuel story. We're not looking at a change in fuels changing the fire regime. It's got to be climate. And then when you look at the global database and put all those global records together, you can see there's a very close sort of tracking between CO2 and generally warm records going from 20,000 into the Holocene here. And this is the levels of biomass burning as a z-score from all of those fire data, being low in the glacial period, rising during deglaciation, and then being high in the Holocene. Okay, so what's the people part of this story? And this is really discussed in every continent, that people are really keen to give people a very significant role in shaping fire regimes. We think that's, I don't know why, we could talk about that probably over beer tonight, but it's really important. And in fact, we do see people using fire in various ways, so it's not saying that people aren't using fire, but you see it in Australia, you see it in our historic paintings from the western U.S. This is Maori burning in New Zealand. This is using fire to hunt guanaco. This is a picture from Australia. So it's not really did people use fire, that's not the question. It's did they use fire to the extent that they altered the natural fire regime? That's my question. And did they do so to the extent that they actually created biomes that wouldn't have existed otherwise? Okay, so I'm not really saying did people set fires. Of course they did. But did they really do it to the extent that we're seeing something that is kind of unique? Well, this debate starts at a global scale, this question. So I don't know if you know Bill Redemann's work, looking at ice core records. And he argues that when you look at the Antarctic ice cores and you look at the methane and the CO2 record, so this is methane and this is CO2, and you look at the last interglacial, in other words, the Holocene, so you're going from into the last 10,000 years. He says the Holocene is fundamentally different than any other interglacial. When you look at the gas bubbles in these cores for that time period, he said that in almost every interglacial you see a peak in methane, and then you see a steady decline in methane. This is greenhouse gas going to the end of the interglacial, leading you into the next ice age. The same with CO2. You see a peak in CO2 initially, and then it steadily declines, and you go into the next ice age. So there's this real fundamental relationship between temperature and greenhouse gases. But in the Holocene, he points out that that doesn't happen, and that you come to about 5,000 years ago in the Holocene record, ice core record, and methane increases. And the same thing about 8,000 years ago, CO2 increases. And he argues that this is the signature of people globally. What they're doing is, through deforestation and agriculture, they're early on altering greenhouse gases and creating a warmer climate and sort of making the Holocene be anomalous to other interglacial periods. So he sees a very strong role for people, you know, a fundamental role in the climate system starting thousands of years ago. So this was tackled by the charcoal community in a paper in Nature led by Jennifer Marlin, who said, is there a relationship between global biomass burning and, say, the recent rise in CO2, the hockey stick curve, where we see low levels of CO2 and then it rises about 200 years ago? And so here's the global data set. So they gathered good 2,000-year records from around the world. And here's the charcoal record. So this is going back, this is 2,000 years or 0 AD, going to present day and that. This is the temperature anomaly. Here's the population trends globally. This is the CO2 record. There's the hockey stick. And this is an estimate of land use cover change. These are global data sets. And so what they noticed was, all right, what you see over most of that 2,000-year period is a decline in burning. So this would be kind of contrary to what Rudiman would say. There's a decline in burnings, and they relate that decline to climate because this is the insulation decline. Summers are getting cooler. Globally, there's generally cooler temperatures globally. And then there's a rise in global fire activity from about 1750 to 1870. And then there's a decline. Now, their record stops at 1950, so they're not totally into the present day fire activity. So 1870, it decreases. And what they argue is what we're seeing is the first part is climate. This is forest clearance by Europeans around the world, clearing up forests. And then this is the decline that happens as you have more effective fire suppression, but also a more fragmented landscape and more elimination of fire. So they don't see this global trend that Rudiman sees. So this is still getting debated in the literature. But one thing for sure is they see this on every continent. So they break this global record up and they see the same signal in North America, in Europe, in the southern hemisphere. The only place they don't see it really strongly is in the Arctic. So it does look like it's a strongly climate signal in their view. So they would argue against people, point to climate more important. They've looked at other places, so the debate goes on at a continental scale. This was a paper that came up by Scott Mooney looking at all of the charcoal records from Australia. So people arrive in Australia about 43,000 years ago. There's a lot of discussion that Aboriginals have been burning consistently ever since then. And they said, when you look at the charcoal records and you do these composites, not much is happening until Europeans come. And it doesn't matter whether you're looking at tropical Australia, there's some bumps, or the southern part of Australia, or mainland Australia. They say even in Australia, it's primarily a climate signal, not a people signal. Well, following up on that was the counterpoint from a group of Australians from Australia National University, and they took a single record, and they said, look, and hopefully you're going to be able to see this. I didn't put any arrows in, but they said, here's when people arrive right here. And they said, at that time, there's nothing happening climatically 40,000 years ago. It's a pretty quiet period. But once people arrive, then you start to see this shift from green, which is rainforest trees, to red, which is eucalyptus and sclerophyll vegetation. And they say that's definitely associated with the arrival of people. And at that time, there's a shift towards the yellow, which is grass. There's a loss of dung spores. These represent megafauna. So there's a period of megafaunal extinction when people come. So you have megaspores you have dung spores showing there's megafauna in Australia. And then that goes away. And then the other thing that happens is you get charcoal records showing up at that time. So they actually take the opposite view, and that is that people really have had a huge influence and that you can't explain this signal without people. Okay. And then I showed you this record last night This is from western U.S., where, again, the argument is that primarily we're not seeing prehistoric people burning, but we're seeing a climate signal. That if you look at the trends between temperature and biomass burning, so biomass burning is in red, and the dotted line is temperature, there's this really faithful tracking over the last 800 years or so where cold periods or warm periods have more fires, cold periods have fewer fires. And the only time you see a disconnect that may be related to people is in the last century, where fire activity's gone down, but temperatures have gone up. So again, these composite records look like they're pointing to climate more than people. Okay, so I have a problem with these composite records at some level, because I think when you aggregate a bunch of data, you oftentimes miss the signal of people, which could be much more subtle. And so I've kind of been unhappy with a lot of these conclusions that automatically assume that there is no human signature, because I don't think the way the data are used in compassing would actually let you see that. And so that's what motivated this PIRE grant, was to look at particular places where we might be able to look at a smaller scale and actually see the influence of people. And some of this just came out this year in a bioscience paper. And what we're focusing on here are the wet temperate forests. So we're working in New Zealand, South Island, New Zealand. We're working in Tasmania, where I'm not going to talk about. We're working in the Pacific Northwest, and we're working in southern Patagonia. And we're working in these forests that I call, they're not rainforests, but they're called, they're kind of mesic to xeric forests, mesic dry forests. So we're not working in the wettest forests that would never burn, but we're working in the forests that are wet, but a little more dry than that. So in this comparison that I want to show you, we're going to look at the Douglas fir forest in the Pacific Northwest. We're going to look at the podocarp southern beech forests, the Nothofagus forests in South Island, New Zealand. And then we're going to look at the Nothofagus forests in Argentina and Chile. And the reason to choose that is because we know they're basically all in the same climate type of zone. If you look at total annual precip and mean annual temperature, they're all kind of in the same area. And so we're really asking the question, what's the signature of people in those regions? Now, people were probably doing the same thing with respect to fire in all of these regions. We don't know for sure. We only infer from modern ethnographic and archaeological information. But generally, people deliberately burn for hunting, for defense, for gathering fruit, berries, and nuts. They burn to facilitate travel through closed forest, and also to maintain certain plants that are important to them in their cultural and sort of economic lifeways. So the bottom line is that people alter natural fire regimes by adding an ignition source that might not have existed. They can change the fire season by deliberately burning, so they can burn at times when there may be highly flammable fuels but no source of ignition, no lightning. And they also can target, so they can keep burning particular vegetation types they want. So I think in any of these regions, that's what people are doing. Now we're comparing some areas in the northern hemisphere with areas in the southern hemisphere, and we're looking at fire history. So there's some large-scale differences between those areas that make it really interesting. So I've been talking about this insolation maximum in the northern hemisphere. So this is present day back to 20,000 years, and this is January to December. And this is the summer months in the middle Holocene has this high insolation period related to the timing of perihelion and the tilt of the Earth's axis. That's in the northern hemisphere, but because we're talking about the southern hemisphere as well, it turns out that the insolation story is just the opposite. So the early Holocene is a summer insolation maximum in the northern hemisphere, but it's a summer insolation minimum in the southern hemisphere. Let's see if I can say this right. And then you go into the late Holocene, it's just the opposite. Insolation is decreasing in the northern hemisphere, but summer insolation is increasing in the southern hemisphere. So how interesting is that? We're going to compare Pacific Northwest with Argentina and New Zealand. And so the large-scale controls are going to be different, even though we think people were maybe using landscapes in the same way. Okay, so the things that I think are really worth studying in this question is we're looking at species that have different life histories and different fire adaptations, so I'll talk about that. I think the other factor that's really important in comparing these regions is that what happens after a fire, an individual fire, is different in these different forests, and I think that's important. And then I talked about the climate differences related to insulation, and I'm not sure about the human uses of fire, but I'm sort of assuming they're broadly the same, but I'm not trying to oversimplify that. Okay, so let's start with New Zealand because it's the most compelling case. New Zealand's really interesting because we know when people arrived, and it was pretty recent. They arrived in New Zealand about 1280 AD. And this is the best date we have. There's still, I guess, a little controversy about that, but I think by and large people accept 1280 AD as the earliest evidence of people in New Zealand. And it's dated by seeds that have been chewed by rats. So they date a whole bunch of seeds, radiocarbon date a whole bunch of seeds. The oldest seeds with rat gnawings are always about 1280 AD. And rats, of course, were introduced by people. There's no, except for bats, there's no native mammals. We think that the first people coming were Polynesians. There was a very small population based on DNA, 100 to 200 individuals. The density was higher in the North Island than in the South Island. Very few people in the South Island. And the South Island is where we're focusing. What we know from the vegetation data, the historical vegetation data, is that New Zealand was completely forested 3,000 years ago, and that by the time the Europeans arrived, about 40% of New Zealand was deforested. So these early Polynesians are responsible for deforesting about 40%, and in particular, they deforested that Podocarp Nothofagus forest. This is the vegetation that's vulnerable to fire, and going back to the traits of the trees, they're very poorly adapted to fire. Nothofagus and Podocarp, they're characterized by thin bark. They have extensive roots near the surface, so they're easily damaged by fire. They tend to rot when they get burned. They're very susceptible to rot. They have no ability to resprout. They never have been in an they've never existed with fire, so they've never developed sprouting. They have heavy seeds. They're not dispersed long distances, and they don't produce a seed bank that persists very long. So what you find in New Zealand is that fires were generally rare before people. Fire return intervals are 1,000 years between fire. This is not a fire landscape. There's not very many ignitions. And the native species are highly vulnerable. So New Zealand went from that to that. And we can measure the time of that transition, and it's really short. It happened in about 20 to 30 years at a single site. So it was this dramatic shift from forest to grasses and shrubs. And you can see it in the charcoal record. It's really amazing. So here's a record. This is about 10,000 years ago to present. Here's a series of lakes from the South Island, New Zealand. Here's the arrival of people. And you can see no fires before then, hardly any fires, and then this huge period of burning that happens. It doesn't happen at the same time at every lake, but there's this really congested period when there's a lot of fires. These dots are the individual fire events. And then a lot of these lakes show that after that there's almost no fires or very small fires, and then the Europeans come and kind of put the topping on the cake. So the initial burning period lasted from about 1300 to 1500, but at single sites it's a very short event that led to the conversion of the forest. And there's the European period. Now one of the things that, how could that happen? How could you go into these forests and burn them and transform them so quickly? Well, part of it, I think, is the lack of adaptation to fire of the vegetation, but also is this post-fire flammability story. What happens in New Zealand is right after a fire, so you burn off your Nothofagus podocarp forest, you get this shrubby vegetation, or these small trees that come in, Manuka and Kanuka. Those things, look at those things, they're highly flammable. And so you have this very high post-fire cohort that comes in right after fire. And if you can keep reburning that, you can basically get rid of the beech forest. The beech forest takes 200, 300 or more years to come back in the absence of fire. And so if you have people targeting ignitions over and over again, they're creating highly flammable vegetation as a serial stage, and the forest can be lost. Okay, so Patagonia is kind of the same story. Here we know people have been around for about 14,000 years. Here's the vegetation zone today. There's a really strong west to east gradient, so you lose the forest in green and it becomes steppe. In the early Holocene, it was more compressed. It was drier in the early Holocene. There's the LGM. And we're still looking at Nothofagus forest. The biggest impact in Patagonia is with Europeans who completely burned big sections of the Nothofagus forest. So when you look at a Patagonian pollen record, this is going from present back to about 18,000 years, what you see is that there's a period of real high fire activity in the early part of the Holocene and in the late glacial transition. So you get lots and lots of charcoal, microscopic charcoal, macroscopic charcoal, lots of fire events. And it's happening in the transition between the glacial grasslands and the arrival of Nothofagus forest. And then once you get Nothofagus forest, a lot of these sites don't show so much in the way of fire, or the fires become very heterogeneous. So the dark circles is Patagonia. Here's where we have charcoal data. The dark circles show where the fires are higher than present. And so you can see there's high fires in Tierra del Fuego about 12,000 years ago, but there's high fires everywhere in the early Holocene. And then by the time you go to 3,000 years ago, it's a much more heterogeneous pattern. So this one seems to be very strongly driven by climate. People could have been in ignition, but we know because of the climate conditions in the early Holocene that this is likely a time of drier conditions and more fires. Here's a composite of that record. So there's a period of high fires in the late glacial. Here's that early Holocene, late glacial period. But there is a period of high fires about 3,000 years ago that shows up at several sites. That could be a signal of people, or it could be an interaction of people and climate. And I'm talking about this period here. So here we go from 20,000 to present. Here's the fire activity of all the records. This is on the east side of this is the east side of the Andes. Here's fire activity, and you can see there's a rise, but there's a lot of variability in the signal. It's a forested period, so you go from no forest to forest. But here's also the time when ENSO kicks in. And ENSO, El Nino, Southern Oscillation, is a very big creator of fires now. It becomes strong in this period of the last 3,000 years. So South America kind of have to punt on a little bit because you've got the kinds of climate forcings for fires in the last 3,000 years, but it's also the time of highest human populations and more sedentary populations. So that one, just can't separate it. So increased fire coincides with interannual climate variability. This is ENSO, as well as rising human populations. Okay, the last example I want to show you is the Pacific Northwest. And here we're talking about the forests that are on the east side of the Coast Range to the west side of the Cascade Range. And this is like my hero tree, Douglas fir, Pseudotsuga menzizii. This is such an amazing tree, and it's the dominant of these forests. And I think because of this tree, you don't get a strong signal of people in these forests. And why do I say that? Well, Douglas fir, because it has this really thick bark, can survive when it's a mature tree. It can survive low and moderate intensity fires. It's got a bark that's like cork. So once it gets to a mature stage, it doesn't burn it's very hard to kill it. It's got thick bark. And also as it grows up, it loses the branches lower down. It gets this elevated crown height. And so it's very hard to kill kill it by getting a crown fire. It's very hard to get a ground fire up into the canopy. It's very resistant to rot if it's injured by fire, unlike Nothofagus. The seed sources are abundant, so if you can keep a few Douglas fir trees alive in your forest, you've got abundant seed source for regenerating within the fire perimeter. And the seeds can disperse up to 400 meters. And what we see on the Holocene in the Pacific Northwest is sort of summarized by this record at Battleground Lake. So here you have, here's the early Holocene, has high fires, but as you go into the late Holocene, fires tend to drop off. The number of fires, and also, actually not the overall levels, but the frequency of fires tends to drop off. And that seems to follow the decline in summer insolation. As you're getting cooler and wetter, you're getting just less fires. The only places where you see the opposite trend is when you're in places like the Willamette Valley, where you're near prairie, and maybe people were deliberately burning there. There's a lot of evidence that prairie areas were maybe actually deliberately kept open by people and burning practices. So the anomaly is where you have grasslands that may have been a reason to burn. The post-fire flammability curve is quite different than the southern hemisphere. Right after fire, you get this sort of not very flammable period of ferns and maple and standing dead wood. And that allows Douglas fir, which is pretty fast growing, to redevelop within a few decades and take over. So rather than see that drop off like in the southern hemisphere, you actually see kind of a dip in flammability. And so this means that even if people burned right after a fire, that targeted burning wouldn't have the same effect because the forest is just not as flammable as it is in the southern hemisphere, that post-fire seral forest. And you get a lot of kinds of different trajectories in Douglas fir forests. So you can burn the forest completely, and then over 300 years, you can get an old cohort of Douglas fir. Or you can only partially burn your forest, in which case some of them some of them persist, and then they can become part of this old cohort. There's a lot of different sort of trajectories where high and low severity fires maintains this sort of multi-cohort forest of old mature trees and young trees coming in. And so a Douglas fir forest tends to look like this. You have generally low flammability in the early stages. You get this mixed severity fire regime. I know some people didn't like that term a couple weeks ago or something. I don't know. Where you have severe fire, you have stand replacing fires and surface fires at the intermediate stages. You can have multiple successional pathways that give you this cohort, mixed cohort. And you find when you get to this stage, you don't find many fires, but fires can be quite large. Okay, so just to summarize this point and bring this to a close, I think the regional differences in life history and the fire adaptations of the dominant trees explain why people had a bigger influence in New Zealand than they do in places like the Pacific Northwest. That people came and they were able to really convert that forest in a way that would be difficult for people in the Northwest. And I should say people have been in the Northwest for about 12,000 years. The positive feedbacks in these vegetation types, these different trajectories of post-fire flammability, are also an important factor. So in New Zealand and Patagonia, you have short duration, high flammability vegetation in the early seral stage. That's not true in the Northwest. And you have a lot of post-fire mature tree survival in the Northwest that you don't see in Patagonia or in New Zealand. So that means you can very easily regrow your forest. And just summarizing the post-fire trajectory, here's the Northwest with a low flammability going to dropping off right after the fire and then becoming more flammable as compared to South Island in New Zealand or Patagonia. So you're going from this to that, but here you have the super high flammability early seral stage. Then I think the Holocene climate controls are important. You know, in the southern hemisphere, you have summer insolation getting higher in the late Holocene, and so becoming more significant, and so your fire climate is more conducive to burning, and so ignitions from people are going to be more effective, whereas in the Pacific Northwest, you're going into a cooler, wetter climate, and even if people were igniting, it would be much harder for the fires to take place. And then this is the one where you just really don't know why people were using fires, so you can assume they were all using it for the same reason. But you know, maybe that's not true. Maybe there was a different motivation for burning in New Zealand. These were Polynesians. They had a history of burning throughout the Pacific Ocean. They seemed to come to islands and right away want to get rid of the forests. Maybe in the Northwest, people didn't see that motivation. Maybe in the Northwest, they were close enough to open landscapes that they didn't see the need to deforest. So you can't be completely certain, you know, what's going on with human motivation. One thing, though, I think when we think about fires, it's very context driven. So if you think about the world's biomes going from forest to desert and to very degraded types, on the one hand, you've got these forests that are really climate limited. The fire regime is limited by climate. And in deserts, in that area, they're limited by fuels. So what I mean is that forests have plenty of fuels. These rainforests have plenty of fuels. They don't have the climate for fire. There's hardly any lightning in these forests. Lightning doesn't come at the right season to be when the fuels are at their driest. So it's a climate-limited fire regime. Whereas when you're in a desert, you have a lot of these deserts and shrublands have a lot of lightning, but the thing that limits fire really is the fuel cover. Fuels are discontinuous. People have the capacity to alter these. So through fire suppression, you can convert a woodland to a forest and move it more into this situation. Through adding ignitions, you can change a closed forest into woodland. In the same way with deserts, you can increase ignitions and make it be a very highly flammable scrubland, or through land clearance, you can convert it to something that's less flammable. So the natural fire regime sort of puts this as the Goldilocks, right? We've got continuous fuel cover and lots of ignitions, but here fire activity is low and here fire activity is low. And in the case of New Zealand and Pacific Northwest and probably Argentina, what people have done is they've really shifted this curve through their use of fire. So we've taken a landscape that's climate limited, and through the addition of ignitions in New Zealand, for example, we've shifted it from over here to a fern scrubland. So I think this is a really important figure to remember when you think about people and the role of fire. It's going to be very context driven, depending on where you are in that spectrum. And the only reason I guess this matters, and this is my last slide, is that, you know, these are some of these wet forests where people are adding ignitions are some of the most sort of vulnerable forests we have, some of the most vulnerable forests if you look at future fire regimes. These are the ones where all the models agree that with climate alone we're going to get more burning. So this is a paper by Max Moritz showing more fires in a 40-year period, and even more fires in these temperate conifer forests going into the future. And here's the broadleaf forests of the southern hemisphere showing more fires in the next 40 years and even more fires. So, you know, we really need to understand what's happened in the past, because these are going to be hugely vulnerable fires as we go into the future. So I'll stop with that, and these are the various people on the PIRE project that at least helped with this particular synthesis. It's been a great group of people from New Zealand and Australia and Southern Hemisphere and also the US. So thank you. Happy to take any questions. Jamie, you must have a question. When I found out Jamie was going to be here from New Zealand, I thought, oh my gosh, I thought this would be an audience I could talk about New Zealand and everyone would believe me. And
Okay, I'll start off. First of all, I'd like to say that overall, our complete people are
okay.
I'll throw you two slight curves. The first one is, with respect to the South Island of New Zealand, the initial population of South Island is actually quite heavy. Those population densities are a bit misleading because you've got places like the Waitaki Mouth where you've got several metres of remains of moa, which is what people went to the South Island for first in order to exploit the obvious food resource, and then they sort of retreated back to the North Island. So there are probably more people there, but more to the point, those large moa were not dense forest types of birds. They required forest margin situations. So I suspect that more of the South Island east coast was open at the time of Maori arrival than the diagram that you put up suggested.
You mean because people were burning on that area, or?
Well, because I think there's natural opening up already
Yeah.
happening on the eastern side of the southwestern side.
I think my colleagues would disagree with you in land care. I'm sure you probably know that.
I'm sure they would.
Yeah. And the sites that we've studied actually are not coastal sites. They're actually sites that are in the mountain areas. So, and they're interesting because they're places where it's really hard to imagine why people would burn. They're not. A lot of them aren't major travel routes. They could have been travel routes, and we're just not identifying them. But we're really in the sort of more to the west on the mountain front. And you see the signal really strongly there. Now, we've got some new records coming from the coast, and we'll see if the signal starts earlier there or if it looks somehow different through time. But the data, these sites aren't from that area.
And then the second one is just, it's more of a query. Patagonia, you correctly pointed out that we've got Milankovitch's opposite forces in the two hemispheres. You'd actually predict that there shouldn't be an early Holocene peak in Patagonia, but there is.
Yeah, and so I didn't want to go into that, but I'm happy to. The reason we think we have more fires in the early Holocene there is perhaps related to the annual cycle of insolation that you find the perihelion. Is it perihelion? What's this? Eccentricity, perihelion, and
So you're going to say the length of the season?
obliquity. The obliquity is higher, and that when you change so we think it's somewhat related to that and what it does to the pole equator temperature gradient. So you get like this permanent positive state of the southern annular mode in the early Holocene, kind of a La Nina condition. I can talk to you about that later, but it is kind of a bit of a conundrum. Yes?
You get down to crumbs of charcoal, they're the size of big grains. How do you recognize it as charcoal? Just by color, by...
Yeah, you can. It has a structure, so wood charcoal really has a structure where you can see the wood. In fact, we can identify some of them as species. And then grass charcoal is very platy, and you can see the ridges of, you can see the ridges and stomates and so on. So, yeah.
Kevin, is there a possibility you get decadal or 100-year cycles in natural ignitions? So I'm thinking of, it seems like in recent years around here we've had a lot more monsoon activity and more lightning. Is that
Yeah, for sure. I mean, ignition's really tied to circulation features related to ENSO and monsoonal circulation. The whole trade-off between monsoons and so when is it too wet in the monsoon for a fire versus when you're just increasing ignition frequency? Yeah, and those things have cycles, for sure. So.
So the Pacific Northwest, people arrived 14,000.
Yeah.
Maybe a little more people after that, but your forest type is so today it's Doug fir, but 14,000 years ago it wasn't. And so could there, and maybe even Patagonia, I don't know if there's as many people down there, but could these forests be changing with people and their fire regime?
Yeah.
To make the current regime?
That's a question a reviewer asked us, and I wonder, so were you the reviewer? Because we had to address that. Well, so it's quite possible that when people came to the Northwest or Patagonia they also had an initial burn period of the same kind of dimensions, right? And we can see it really clearly when it's 1,000 years ago, but we can't see it when it's 11,000 years ago. I think that's possible, but we also know the vegetation when people arrived was so different that I can't believe there was an initial burning period. It was tundra landscape, it was subalpine vegetation, but it is possible there's an initial burn period, but they're not burning the same kind of vegetation. It wouldn't have the same flammability. It wouldn't have anything in the same. So really, it is a bit of a miscomparison because we're looking at people being on the landscape and being quite large populations in the late Holocene.
Human burning have promoted a Doug fir forest more so. Like, the
Yeah.
trends are coming and going. I don't buy that. But maybe as an alternative, maybe now Doug fir are really prominent because they can withstand more frequent burning.
Yeah, from New Zealand, you have this kind of forest that adapted to humans because they set fire in the only forest left was this kind of bombs that resist when it became sprawl. There's this large forest, one dominant kind of vegetation, so it can have
In New Zealand.
in Brazil.
Oh, in Brazil, yeah. I wouldn't have thought Douglas fir was that story. I would have thought that in the early Holocene there was more expanded prairies and that people burned to keep those prairies open in places like Willamette Valley or southern Puget Lowland or southern part of Vancouver Island. That I would have thought that would be the human signature, that you take the Holocene early Holocene vegetation that you think might be something that could be a cultural landscape, and then you could imagine that persisting. But with the expansion of Douglas fir, given the characteristics, I think it would be really hard to think of that as a humanized vegetation type. I have to think about that.
I don't buy it either, but
Okay.
that's a question.
Okay, thanks. Well, great. Well, thank you very much.